Cohen, you have an excellent voice. You ought to think about using that. Preaching is an open field. There are lots of opportunities, and many churches needing preachers. And Dennis, I could listen to you for hours. I find this whole chemistry, biology stuff absolutely fascinating. I don't know how anyone who has any knowledge in those fields can ever be an atheist. And if you were listening carefully, I'm sure that you reached a similar conclusion as he spoke to us tonight. But I have to tell you, I'm not afraid of snakes. I read that that fear is rooted in our evolutionary history, that our ancient ancestors were often the victims of serpent attacks. And that fear has just continued as we have evolved. I also have a nickel that's worth $1 million. I'll sell it to you for $150,000. Yeah, it just amazes me what people will believe. We're in Daniel chapter 3 this evening, beginning in verse 13. Daniel 3 is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are servants of the Most High God who are in high positions in Babylonian government. They, along with all of the high officials, have been summoned to the plains of Dura, where this 90-foot image has been erected, and when the orchestra plays, everyone is to bow. But as you know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow. That was called to the attention of King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were immediately summoned for an explanation. This is where we pick up our story tonight. The whole purpose of Daniel, from my perspective, is to remind readers that God is in charge. It doesn't matter if you're the king of the greatest nation on earth, God is still in charge. No matter what you do, how successful you are, God is still in charge. Don't get too full of yourself, or God will knock you down a notch or two. And the next chapter illustrates that principle in a profound way. But Nebuchadnezzar has erected this image. Some believe that it was symbolic of the king himself, and has requested everyone in a position of leadership in government to bow. But these Hebrew boys, who are now young men, have grown up hearing all their lives the law of Moses and the prohibition against graven images and worshiping anything or anyone other than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the same boys with Daniel who refused to eat the king's dainties, that insisted on a diet of vegetables and water because they did not want to be defiled. There are some who say that if you're faithful in the big things, the little things don't matter, but my judgment is, as you read Daniel, if you're faithful in the little things, when the big things come along, you'll still be faithful. And I think they prove that. In chapter 1, they were faithful in what most folks would consider, I think, rather small matters. But now this is a major issue. How do you respond? How would you respond? It's easy to give an answer when you're not in that situation. I know how we ought to respond, but would we have the courage and conviction of these three young men? Because, as the old Statler Brothers song says, they wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, and they wouldn't burn. And by the way, if you listen to our radio program on Sundays, I don't use the Statler Brothers. There's an excellent quartet that I do use from time to time. And they do sound a little like the Statler brothers, but they're not. They're all members of the church, and if you're drawing that conclusion, it's false. Let's look at the text again now, beginning in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage. Do you ever find yourself in a furious rage? I get upset, just to be frank with you. But I really can't recall a time when I was in a furious rage. I've seen people that way. It's not a good thing. It's all right to be angry. In fact, as a Christian, there are things that ought to anger us, but Ephesians 4:26 reminds us that we're to be angry and sin not. He's in a furious rage, and he commands that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are their Babylonian names given to them when they were brought from Jerusalem to Babylon for their education and indoctrination. So they brought these men before the king. Now, the charge has been leveled. Why doesn't the king simply say, round them up and toss them in? I suspect, and you can take this for what it's worth, he wasn't certain that the report he received was all that reliable. These are foreigners, and foreigners are generally looked down upon, especially when they do really well and supersede native citizens. These young men have been elevated to positions of authority, no doubt over Babylonians who thought they were better qualified, and because they were Babylonians, they should have those positions. Nebuchadnezzar's not a dummy. He knows that these things happen, and so he wants to verify the facts, which is always important. Did you notice that yesterday the truth finally came out about that officer who was killed during the uprising? For months, we have been told that he was hit with a fire extinguisher during the insurrection and died from his wounds. I told you a month and a half ago that it was all a lie. I don't know if you bothered to find the truth or not. They put his body in the rotunda of the Capitol, and they made a lot of political hay out of it. The fact of the matter was he had a stroke and died. Had absolutely nothing to do with the events of that day. And I'm not defending those events. I'm just saying to you, don't believe everything you hear the moment you hear it. In fact, of the 5 people who died during the insurrection, in addition to the officer, one victim died of an overdose of drugs, 2 of heart attacks, and the only person actually to die as a direct result was a woman who was 35 years and shot, and to this day they won't identify who shot her or why. So when you hear things, don't jump to conclusions. Try to get at the facts. There was a young girl killed in Columbus yesterday, 16 years old, I believe. LeBron James immediately tweeted a picture of the officer who shot her and said, "You're next." He never bothered to find out that the woman, the young girl, was wielding a knife and attacking 2 other women, young girls, and that a man was kicking a girl in the head when the officers arrived. They just jumped to conclusions. Nebuchadnezzar is a whole lot smarter than half our nation, in my judgment, and all of our newsmen and women, because he wants the fact. If you say that's getting too political, get over it. I don't care. You need to have the facts. And Nebuchadnezzar wants the facts. Where do you get the facts? You go to the source. this really true? Is this what happened? I want to know. So, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, I honestly, when I read the scriptures, wonder why things are stated the way they are. He answered or he said, why do we need to have both? But this is the kind of expression that you find throughout the Bible, and I suspect it's there so we don't misunderstand. The king himself will interrogate. He answers and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Well, if you want the truth, you get it from the horse's mouth, don't you? You don't take the word of people who already have a grudge and are out to get them. You go to the source, and this is what he does. And he offers them a second chance. Does this sound like Nebuchadnezzar that we met in chapter 2, who said to his magicians, astrologers, soothsayers, and Chaldeans, if you can't tell me my dream and what it means, I'll pull you limb from limb and destroy your houses and your families. And he meant it. And they were in process of rounding them all up to carry out the execution orders when Daniel intervened and told the king his dream and its meaning. But with these three young men, he's ready to give them a second chance. If you are ready when you hear the sound of the band playing, saves me reading all of those instruments, to fall down and worship the image, there's nothing difficult to understand about what the king has required. If you're ready to do that, well and good. This can all be taken care of in a moment. All you have to do when the band plays is fall on your face before the image. But, and this is key, if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? See, this is Nebuchadnezzar full of himself saying, I have all power. There's nobody that can help you. You do what I say or you suffer the consequences. That is just, from a biblical perspective, an invitation for God to step in and put somebody in their place. And it's not the first time that he will do that. I want to take you very quickly to 2 Kings chapter 18. You can turn there, or if you trust me to read it correctly, I promise to do that. In 2 Kings 18, the Assyrian army has invaded. These are the folks that Nebuchadnezzar whipped before he whipped Israel and Jerusalem. The text says, chapter 18, I'll begin reading, mid the 32nd verse. Do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, and Hena, and Diva? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their land out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? So Sennacherib and his Assyrian army are knocking on the gates of Jerusalem and saying, your king is telling you, don't worry, God will step in and take care of us. But has he been able to do that thus far? Haven't we defeated all of our enemies? What makes you special? Your God is no better than all these other gods, and what did that get them? Chapter 19. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you've heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. Shall you be delivered? Not going to happen. But here's the close of chapter 19. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. 185,000 were struck down. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian nation. And as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, Adramelech and Sharezer, his son, struck him down with a sword and escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. Well, we've got a similar situation now in Daniel chapter 3. The power of God has been challenged as Sennacherib challenged it in the days of Hezekiah. Nebuchadnezzar now challenges it in relationship to Daniel and his three friends. Your God is nothing. What can he do? He can't stop me. He can't save you. That's how Nebuchadnezzar reasoned. But we know the story, don't we? He could not have been, I'd say wronger if I were across the river, but since I'm in Ohio, could not have been more incorrect. No offense to you folks from West Virginia, because that's where I hail from. So, Marge, I wasn't trying to be offensive there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. There it is, answered and said to the king. I prefer just answered or said, but that's not how it's written. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Now, what are they saying? Our minds are made up. This is a done deal. We know what we ought to do, and we're going to do what we ought to do. We're not going to take the easy way. We're not going to compromise. We stand on principle. And the principle is, thou shalt have no other gods. And thou shalt worship no other gods. In response to his argument, they say, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning, fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. They're saying our God has the power to protect us in your furnace. But either way, he will deliver us. If not delivering us from the fire of your furnace, he'll deliver us by death. He'll take us out of this sin-filled, wicked world to a better place. It's win-win for us. We're not going to do it. Don't you marvel at their courage and faith? During the Maccabean period and the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, this was one of those stories that the Maccabees relied upon to bolster their faith in the face of all those efforts to eradicate Judaism from the face of the earth. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can stand strong and be firm, so can we. So we know what our God can do. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Now let me paraphrase this for you. They said, our God is able to deliver us. We don't know if he will or he won't. Doesn't matter. We will not bow before your image. There is a power higher and greater than you. We have been now for several weeks going through the book of Acts. In chapters 4 and 5, you surely discovered that there is a principle that governs people of God in all ages. It is the very simple fundamental fact of Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. When men come down in opposition to God, men of God always stay with God. They don't compromise. They don't take the easy way. They stand tall and courageous. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. How dare you? Don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I can do to you, what I'm going to do to you? How can you talk to me this way? That's what he's thinking. This is human nature. I give the orders, I call the shots, you either listen and obey or off with your head, so to speak. It says, and the expression of his face was changed against these three young men. You could see it on his face. I have been in situations where people have gotten angry with me because they've asked a question, and my policy is very simple. If you ask a question of me, I will give you an honest answer. Even if I know you don't want that answer, I'm still going to tell you the truth. And people can get really upset in a hurry, and you just see it on their face. Sometimes they just get redder than a beet, and their expression is altered to the extreme, and you can just almost see the anger shooting out of their ears and nostrils. Well, that's the picture that I have of Nebuchadnezzar here. How dare you? Who do you think you are? So he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. This is an idiom. That is an expression that is designed to convey an idea that's not to be taken necessarily literally. What he's really doing here is saying, you heat that rascal as hot as you can make it. You get everything out of it you can get and then more, because they're going in and there's no way they're coming out alive. He ordered some of his mighty men, some of the mighty men of his army, to bind these 3 young men. Why mighty men? I suspect that, he is well aware from his other encounters and what he had seen in his relationship with Daniel that there is a God who does have some power. He thinks no one has the kind of power that would be necessary to deliver these men from their fate, but he's not taking any chances. He gets his toughest soldiers. And he binds these 3 young men. I don't know to what extent. I suspect that they were bound hand and foot. There's no way that they can run. There's no way that they can fight. They can't defend themselves. They're like a log, each one, just to be picked up and tossed into a furnace. So he gets the toughest soldiers in his army to deal with them. And then these men are bound, the text says, in their cloaks, their tunics, and their hats. The terminology that's actually used in the original text is such that biblical scholars don't even know for sure what these terms actually mean. These are the best guesses, because even by the time that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, had been completed, the true meaning of these words had been lost. And so scholars do their best guesses. It's not terribly important, other than for me to tell you that that's just one more indication that this book was written in the days of Daniel and not 300 years or 400 years after Daniel, because by the time the translation from Hebrew to Greek has been completed. These words have already fallen out of favor, and their true meaning has been unknown. It's just one more testament to the fact that we're dealing with real historical events and a God who knows the end from the beginning and who works wondrous works to demonstrate that He is truly in charge. So they're just tied up, clothes and all, including their head coverings, and they're thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Looks to me like there should have been a space between burning and fiery that I missed, but maybe not. Doesn't show up here, but Diane were here, she'd point that out to me. So, because the king's order was urgent, the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The obvious implication is that their garments caught on fire and they burned up. You can face a lot of heat for a short period of time and really not affect you. I worked in a Coke factory, Coke for the steel mill. It was a factory that produced Coke by pouring it into furnaces that were in a line, a battery, and you would loot the doors, take a special mixture when everything has been charged and the doors placed on, and fill in all the cracks so the heat doesn't escape. You could just be, sweating like a workhorse that's been in the field all day. Walk up to the door and start the looting process, and you are instantly dried. It was that hot, but you didn't stand there till you cooked. You're smart enough not to do that. And the heat, our bodies are amazing things. We're able to handle it. But if your clothing catches on fire, you're pretty much done for. And that's generally what the biblical scholars say happened here. These mighty men are working with such haste that they don't take proper precautions, and they catch their own garments on fire, and they perish. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the furnace. They're cast in. They fell down bound, the record says, into the burning, fiery furnace. Kind of like tossing logs on a fire. Now, I mentioned to you last week that what we're able to discern archaeologically and historically is that these furnaces were large and, to the best of our ability to really identify them, shaped somewhat like those old milk jugs that some of you may still remember. And you fed things from the top in terms of material, which is the same exit for the smoke and fumes. And then you fed the wood and materials from the bottom, and the ore is in the middle, and it runs out. And there were holes for bellows to increase the heat. This thing is as hot as it's ever going to get. And they're tossed in just like firewood to be burned. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose up in haste. Is that the text I want? Yeah. And he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" That's kind of a silly question, isn't it? Of course you did. You gave the order yourself and they carried it out. Why would you ask that? They said, "True, O king." Well, what in the world is going on then? I see 4 men. They're unbound. They're walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. If you have the King James translation, like the Son of God. I don't think that's a fair and accurate translation, nor the proper meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's words. But Burton Kaufman would differ with me. If you read the Kaufman series of commentaries on Daniel, he is convinced that Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I see the Son of God. I think probably what he's identifying is an angel. He would have had no concept of the Son of God as we understand that terminology from the New Testament. Angels was a common usage in Scripture, and no doubt in regard to Babylon at this time. It's obviously not an ordinary person that would be there with these three boys. There's something special about his appearance. I have no idea what is going on here. You want to know how God could take these three young men and protect them in a furnace as hot as it can be heated. I don't have an explanation for you other than God can do anything that power can do. Now, we have the scientific capabilities to produce suits that protects from extreme heat and extreme cold, but that's not what's going on here. This is a supernatural event. If you have a problem with supernatural events, you have a problem with God, and you just have problems. But if you believe that God is indeed Lord of the universe, creator of everything we see about us, including man himself, then he can deliver, as these three young men have asserted, from the fire. Well, that's just a fairy tale story that never really, yes, it really happened, folks. I don't find this any more difficult to accept than Jesus dying at Calvary, being removed from the cross and put in a tomb before 6 that Friday evening, and Sunday morning, he's alive and well. God, who could raise Jesus, and he did, can protect his servants in a fiery furnace, and he did. Don't let people try to destroy your faith by saying that the Bible's just filled with stories that are unbelievable. They're only unbelievable when you reject the power of an omnipotent God. That word omnipotent means all-powerful. And when we say God is all-powerful, anything that power can do, God can do. So don't get in these foolish arguments about, can he make a square circle? That's silly. By definition, it's not possible. No power can do what cannot be done. God has limited himself in that he cannot sin and he cannot lie. But protecting from the heat of a furnace is not hard for the God who created the sun and the moon and the stars. And he protected his servants. But now thus says the Lord, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I've called you by name, you're mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. The words of Isaiah 43, 1 and 2. Is it possible that Isaiah was looking down the road to this very kind of thing and saying in advance, this is the nature of the God we worship and serve? Contrast him with all the pagan deities of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone who can do nothing. And he can deliver from all kinds of problems. Hebrews 11, 32 through 34. What shall I more say, or what more shall I say? For time will fail me to tell of Gideon. If you don't know these stories, you really need to go back and read the book of Judges. And Barak, Samson, Jephthah, then read the Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel and learn of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, chapter 6 of Daniel, quenched the power of fire, chapter 3 of Daniel, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. This is a commentary of sorts over the kinds of things that God did in the course of bringing His Son into the world by preserving Israel. And that's really what the Old Testament is all about. We have Genesis through Malachi to show us how God accomplished His purpose through the lineage of Abraham to bless the whole world through Abraham's seed. And what do we always stop and say when we mention Abraham's seed? Galatians chapter 3, Paul says, and seed not as of many, but as one. And if you don't like the word seed, use offspring. He will bless the whole world through one offspring of Abraham, and he identifies that seed or offspring as none other than Jesus Christ. The Old Testament is the story of how God brought Jesus, the Savior of the world, into this world. And there were times when He intervened in a miraculous way, as He does here in chapter 3. Can you imagine now what Nebuchadnezzar's take on the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is? These Jews are going to be treated a whole lot better when we all understand the God they serve has the power that He clearly has. God didn't do this just so these boys could have a story to tell their grandchildren. He did it to send a profound message to Nebuchadnezzar. You are too full of yourself. And the fact is, there is only one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Be good to my people Israel. And Israel, for all practical purposes during the Babylonian captivity, were treated well. And when Babylon fell and the Medo-Persian Empire began, one of the first things that Cyrus did was say to those Israelites in Babylon who wanted to go home, you're free to go. And ultimately, the government even paid for the rebuilding of their temple and of the city walls. I don't think that would have happened if things like the events in Daniel had not actually occurred. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. And the record says they came out from the fire. They immediately obeyed the king because the king had not asked of them anything that was in any way in conflict with the law of God. You see, you don't have a right just to say no because it's inconvenient or you don't particularly find it appealing. The time to say no is when you're asked to do something that you know to be completely contrary to the will of God. There's nothing wrong with them coming out of the furnace. So they came out at the king's bidding, but they weren't about to bow before that image. In life, you've got to learn to make the distinctions that these boys made and know what battles are to be fought and what ones aren't worth fighting. They could have said, you are an arrogant, puffed up, self-willed monarch that we don't have to listen to. But they didn't. That was not the right approach. If you don't tell us to do things that are contrary to God's word, we're okay with it. But we will always obey God over you. And that's where we have to close tonight our study.